I sat in my car outside Fleet Forward Logistics headquarters on December 20th, staring at the termination letter clutched in my trembling hands. After building their revolutionary truck routing system from scratch over 3 years, they just fired me before Christmas and demanded I hand over all passwords to the proprietary software I legally owned through my consulting contract. The irony burned deep. They wanted to steal the very system that made them millions while throwing me out like garbage during the holidays. 3 years ago, when Marcus Weatherby first called me into his corner office at Fleet Forward Logistics, I thought I was walking into the opportunity of a lifetime. The company was hemorrhaging money, losing major contracts, because their ancient dispatch system couldn't handle modern logistics demands. Marcus, a silver-haired man in his 50s who wore expensive suits but couldn't hide his desperation, painted a picture of corporate crisis that needed immediate intervention. "Celia," he said, leaning forward across his mahogany desk, "we're drowning here. Our current system was built in the 90s, and it shows. Delivery times are unpredictable, our drivers are frustrated, and our customers are jumping ship to competitors who actually know where their packages are." I had graduated from the University of Texas with a computer science degree and spent 5 years at various tech startups watching brilliant ideas either soar or crash based on execution. Fleet Forward represented something different. I established company with real revenue and genuine problems I could solve. The challenge excited me more than any coding project I'd tackled before. Operations Director Janet Sullivan joined us for the technical discussion. Janet was in her early 40s, sharp and ambitious, with auburn hair, always pulled into a perfect bun. She understood the operational side better than anyone, having worked her way up from dispatcher to management over 15 years. During our first meeting, she seemed genuinely impressed by my vision for an AI-powered routing system that could optimize 700 truck routes simultaneously. "The current system takes our dispatchers 3 hours every morning just to plan basic routes," Janet explained, pulling out printed spreadsheets covered in handwritten notes. "By the time they finish traffic, conditions have changed, weather has shifted, and half the routes are already obsolete. We're essentially flying blind." I spent 2 weeks analyzing their existing infrastructure, interviewing drivers, and mapping their operational challenges. The scope was enormous. 700 vehicles covering 12 states, handling everything from overnight envelope delivery to furniture shipments requiring special handling. Their current software couldn't even track vehicles in real time, relying instead on periodic check-ins that left massive gaps in visibility. My proposal was ambitious: a complete overhaul using machine learning algorithms that would consider traffic patterns, weather conditions, vehicle capacity, driver schedules, and customer preferences to create optimal routes that updated automatically throughout the day. The system would also include predictive analytics to anticipate problems before they occurred and suggest proactive solutions. The contract negotiation took weeks. My lawyer advised me to retain intellectual property rights, given that I would be developing entirely new technology using my own methodologies. Marcus initially resisted, but his desperation ultimately won. The final agreement granted Fleet Forward licensing rights to use my system while I maintained ownership of the underlying code and algorithms. In exchange, I would receive a substantial consulting fee plus performance bonuses tied to measurable improvements in delivery efficiency. For 18 months, I practically lived in Fleet Forward's cramped server room, surviving on coffee and determination. The work was exhausting, but exhilarating. I was building something revolutionary from the ground up, writing thousands of lines of code that would transform how logistics operated. The AI component alone required training on millions of data points, teaching the system to recognize patterns that human dispatchers couldn't possibly track manually. Janet became my closest collaborator during development. She would spend hours explaining operational nuances I couldn't have understood otherwise. How driver personalities affected performance, which customers required special handling, where seasonal fluctuations created unexpected bottlenecks. Her insights were invaluable for creating a system that worked in the real world, not just in theoretical models. The launch exceeded everyone's expectations. Delivery times improved by 40% within 6 months. Customer satisfaction scores jumped from 62% to 91%. Most importantly for Marcus Company, revenue increased from $12 million to $38 million annually as word spread about Fleet Forward's unprecedented reliability and efficiency. But success brought unexpected complications. Marcus began demanding increasingly detailed reports about how the system worked, pushing for documentation that would allow others to understand and potentially replicate my algorithms. He hired additional staff for the IT department, ostensibly to support the growing system, but I noticed they spent considerable time studying my code rather than maintaining infrastructure. During my second year, Marcus implemented cost-cutting measures that seemed targeted at reducing my consulting fees. He questioned every expense, delayed bonus payments, and began suggesting that my system was now mature enough to require less oversight. The man who had begged me to save his company was now treating me like an unnecessary expense he couldn't wait to eliminate. The breaking point came during a board meeting I wasn't supposed to hear. I had arrived early to fix a minor server issue when voices carried through the thin conference room walls. Marcus was explaining to the board how they could eliminate the consultant problem by claiming ownership of my system through creative interpretation of our contract terms. "The lawyers think we can argue this was work for hire," Marcus said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of calculated greed I'd grown to recognize. "She built it on our premises using our data for our specific needs. We have a solid case for claiming ownership, and even if she fights it, the legal costs will bankrupt her long before it reaches trial." My blood turned to ice as Janet's voice joined the conversation. "I've been documenting everything she does, like you asked. We have enough information to maintain the system without her, and I've identified the key components we'd need to replicate if necessary." Standing in that server room, surrounded by the humming machines that contained my life's work, I realized I had been systematically betrayed by the two people I trusted most. The woman I had mentored and supported was actively plotting against me, while the man whose company I had saved was planning to steal the very innovation that made his success possible. The next morning, I marched into Marcus's office without an appointment, my heart pounding, but my resolve crystalline clear. He looked up from his computer with the practiced smile of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of corporate manipulation. "Celia," he said warmly, as if we were old friends catching up over coffee, "what brings you by so early? I heard your board meeting yesterday," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. "I know about your plan to steal my system." His smile faltered for exactly 3 seconds before reassembling into something harder and more calculated. "I'm not sure what you think you heard, but I can assure you that Fleet Forward has always operated within full legal boundaries regarding our business relationships." The corporate doublespeak made my skin crawl. This was the same man who had desperately pleaded for my help when his company was circling the drain, now speaking to me like a problem to be managed, rather than the person who had saved his career. "Our contract is crystal clear about intellectual property ownership." I continued, pulling out my copy of the signed agreement. "I retain all rights to my algorithms, my code, and my innovations. You have licensing rights, nothing more." Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers in a gesture I recognized as his preparation for delivering bad news. "Contracts can be subject to interpretation, Celia. Legal precedent often supersedes written agreements when the circumstances warrant review." Before I could respond, there was a knock on the office door. Marcus called for the visitor to enter, and in walked a man I'd never seen before. Tall, impeccably dressed, with the cold confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating people for a living. "Celia Martinez," Marcus said with obvious satisfaction. "Meet Bradley Hartwell from Hartwell Morrison & Associates. Bradley specializes in intellectual property law and has been reviewing our relationship with external contractors." Bradley extended his hand with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Ms. Martinez, I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your work has been quite impressive, though there are some interesting legal questions surrounding its ownership status." He opened a leather briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of documents. "I've been conducting a comprehensive analysis of your contract with Fleet Forward, and I've identified several areas where the language creates ambiguity about intellectual property rights. My lawyer had warned me that companies sometimes employed legal intimidation tactics, but experiencing it firsthand was surreal. Bradley spread papers across Marcus's desk, pointing to highlighted sections and speaking in the clinical tone of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "The key issue," he continued, "is that your system was developed specifically for Fleet Forward's unique operational requirements using their proprietary business data and implemented entirely on their premises. Legal precedent strongly suggests this constitutes work for hire regardless of what your initial contract might have stated." I felt my chest tightening as he continued his presentation, producing case studies and court decisions that seemed to support his interpretation. The documents looked official and overwhelming, filled with legal terminology I didn't fully understand, but that clearly threatened everything I had built. Furthermore, Bradley added, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone, "Your continued control over critical business systems creates an untenable situation for Fleet Forward. No responsible company can allow external parties to maintain absolute control over their operational infrastructure." The conference room door opened again, and Janet walked in, carrying her own folder of documents. The woman who had been my closest collaborator for 3 years couldn't meet my eyes as she took a seat at the conference table. "Janet has been documenting some concerning patterns in your recent behavior," Marcus said, his voice now openly hostile. "Territorial attitudes, reluctance to provide necessary documentation, and what appears to be deliberate obfuscation of critical system functions." Janet finally looked at me, her expression a mixture of guilt and manufactured righteousness. "Celia, you know I respect your technical abilities, but your refusal to properly document the system has created serious business continuity risks. When board members ask basic questions about how our own operations work, we shouldn't have to get permission from an outside contractor." The betrayal was so complete and so calculated that I almost laughed. These people had systematically planned my destruction while pretending to value my contributions. Janet had spent months manipulating our conversations, gathering ammunition for this exact moment. "I've documented everything according to our contract terms," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I've provided detailed operational manuals, training materials, and comprehensive system architecture guides. What you're really asking for is complete access to my proprietary algorithms so you can eliminate me entirely." Bradley interrupted, with the practiced ease of someone who had delivered similar ultimatums countless times before. "Ms. Martinez, let's be realistic about your situation. Fleet Forward is prepared to offer you a generous settlement of $50,000 in exchange for transferring complete system ownership to the company. This would resolve all outstanding intellectual property questions and allow you to move forward with other opportunities." $50,000 for a system that had generated tens of millions in additional revenue and would continue generating profits for decades. The insult was so profound I could barely process it. "And if I refuse?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Marcus leaned forward with undisguised satisfaction. "Then we'll be forced to terminate your consulting relationship and pursue all available legal remedies to protect our business interests. Bradley's firm has extensive experience with intellectual property disputes, and they're confident about the strength of our position." I looked around the room at these 3 people who had systematically planned my professional destruction, and something crystallized inside me. They had underestimated me fundamentally, assuming that their legal intimidation and financial pressure would force me to surrender without a fight. "I need time to consider your offer," I said, standing up and gathering my papers. Bradley smiled with predatory confidence. "Of course, but given the urgent nature of our business operations, we'll need your decision by close of business tomorrow. Delays in resolving this matter would be unfortunate for all parties involved." As I walked toward the door, Janet called after me with what sounded like genuine concern. "Celia, please be reasonable about this. Fighting over something that can't be changed will only hurt everyone involved." I paused at the doorway and looked back at her. "You're right, Janet. Fighting over something that can't be changed would be pointless. But my system belongs to me, and that's not going to change regardless of how many lawyers you hire." That evening I called Thomas Chen, the attorney, who had helped me negotiate my original contract. After explaining the situation, his response was exactly what I had feared. "Celia, you're absolutely right about the contract terms, but Bradley's not wrong about the practical challenges. Intellectual property litigation can drag on for years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Even if you ultimately win, the financial burden could destroy you long before you see any resolution." The legal system I had trusted to protect my rights was apparently designed to favor whoever could afford the longest court battle. Marcus and his lawyers were counting on my inability to finance a protracted legal war, betting that financial pressure would force me to accept their insulting offer rather than risk total bankruptcy. But as I sat in my apartment that night reviewing my contract and analyzing my options, I realized they had made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed I was just a contractor who could be intimidated and discarded. They had forgotten that I was also the architect of a system they couldn't possibly understand or control without me. December 20th arrived gray and cold, with snow beginning to fall as I drove to Fleet Forward's headquarters for what I somehow knew would be my final day as their consultant. My security badge still worked at the front entrance, but I noticed the receptionist watching me more carefully than usual as I signed in. The elevator ride to the third floor felt like ascending to my own execution. I had spent the previous evening researching my legal options and preparing for various scenarios, but nothing could have prepared me for the calculated cruelty of what awaited me in Conference Room B. Marcus sat at the head of the polished table, flanked by Janet and a man I didn't recognize, younger than me, probably in his late 20s, with the eager expression of someone who thought he was about to inherit a kingdom. The laptop in front of him displayed what appeared to be system architecture diagrams. My system architecture diagrams. "Celia," Marcus said without preamble, "I'd like you to meet Derek Thompson, our new interim systems administrator. Derek has been familiarizing himself with our technical infrastructure in preparation for some organizational changes we're implementing." My stomach dropped as I realized the full scope of their preparation. They hadn't just planned to fire me. They had been actively training my replacement, giving him access to documentation and system components I had never authorized for external review. "Derek has an impressive background in logistics software," Janet added, her voice carrying the rehearsed quality of someone delivering prepared remarks. "He previously worked for Transglobal Systems and has extensive experience with large-scale routing applications." The conference room's large monitor flickered to life, displaying a video call connection. Bradley Hartwell's face appeared on screen, joining us from what appeared to be his law office. The formal setup made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. It was a sentencing. "Good morning, Ms. Martinez," Bradley said with professional courtesy that felt like ice. "I trust you've had sufficient time to consider Fleet Forward's generous offer regarding the intellectual property transfer." I looked around the room at these 4 people who had orchestrated my professional destruction with the precision of a military operation. They had timed everything perfectly, firing me right before Christmas when courts would be closed for weeks, ensuring I couldn't seek immediate legal relief. The casual cruelty of their timing wasn't accidental. "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "My contract is clear, and my intellectual property rights are non-negotiable." Marcus's expression shifted from corporate politeness to open hostility. "In that case, Celia, I'm afraid we have no choice but to terminate your consulting relationship effective immediately. Fleet Forward can no longer afford to maintain business relationships with contractors who refuse to cooperate with reasonable requests." He slid a termination letter across the table, along with a document I recognized as a comprehensive system access surrender form. They wanted passwords, administrative codes, documentation keys, and complete technical specifications for every component I had built. "These are not reasonable requests," I replied, leaving the papers untouched. "You're demanding complete surrender of my intellectual property without compensation, in direct violation of our signed contract." Derek spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed he understood technology far better than he actually did. "Ms. Martinez, I've been reviewing your system architecture, and I'm confident I can maintain and improve upon the existing infrastructure. Your cooperation with the transition would be helpful, but it's not strictly necessary." The arrogance was breathtaking. This kid thought he could master in weeks what had taken me years to develop and refine. He had no understanding of the complexity beneath the surface, the countless edge cases and optimization algorithms that made the system work reliably under real-world conditions. "Derek," I said, turning to face him directly, "can you explain how the dynamic load balancing protocol handles cascade failures when multiple routes experience simultaneous disruptions?" His confident expression faltered slightly. Well, I haven't had time to review every technical detail yet, but I'm sure the documentation covers all critical procedures. What documentation would that be? I asked. The operational manuals that explain how to use the system or the algorithmic specifications that explain how it actually works. The distinction was crucial and everyone in the room knew it. I had provided extensive documentation about how to operate my system, but the underlying code and algorithms remained proprietary. Without understanding the mathematical foundations, Derek would be like a mechanic trying to repair a jet engine using only the pilot's manual. Janet leaned forward with obvious frustration. Celia, this is exactly the kind of territorial behavior that's created this entire situation. A system this critical to our operations can't remain dependent on one person's specialized knowledge. Then you should have negotiated ownership rights in your original contract, I replied. You can't retroactively claim ownership of intellectual property because you've decided it's inconvenient to honor our agreement. Bradley's voice cut through the tension from the monitor. Ms. Martinez, I need to inform you that your continued refusal to cooperate may constitute corporate sabotage under federal law. Deliberately withholding critical business information could result in both civil and criminal liability. The legal threat was designed to terrify me into compliance, but I had spent enough time researching my rights to recognize the bluff. My contract explicitly protected my intellectual property, and no law required me to surrender legally owned technology simply because my client found it convenient. Sue me, I said, standing up and walking toward the door. Marcus's voice rose with genuine anger for the first time. Celia, if you walk out that door without providing system access, we'll have no choice but to pursue every available legal remedy. You'll spend the next 5 years in court and end up with nothing. I paused at the conference room door and looked back at him. Marcus, 3 years ago, you were begging me to save your failing company. I worked 18-hour days for months, sacrificing my personal life and my health to build something revolutionary that made you wealthy beyond your expectations. And now you're trying to steal it from me before Christmas, like some corporate Grinch. Business is business, he replied coldly. Sentimental attachments don't pay the bills or satisfy shareholders. You're right, I said. Business is business, and my business is intellectual property that I own, that I control, and that I'm taking with me. As I walked through Fleet Forward's offices for the last time, gathering my few personal belongings, under the watchful eye of a security guard, my phone buzzed with an automated alert. Someone was attempting unauthorized access to my system's administrative functions, using brute force password attacks to break through security protocols I had specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of intrusion. Sitting in my car in the snowy parking lot, watching my breath fog in the cold air, I realized that Marcus and his team had fundamentally misunderstood the situation. They thought they were firing a contractor who had become inconveniently territorial about her work. What they had actually done was declare war on the person who controlled the central nervous system of their entire operation. The 30-minute drive home from Fleet Forward became an extended strategy session, with myself working through options and implications while snow continued falling across the Dallas suburbs. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I processed the full scope of what had just happened and what needed to happen next. Okay, Celia, I said aloud, finding comfort in hearing my own voice articulate the situation clearly. They want to play hardball corporate games. Let's see how well they understand the system they're trying to steal. Most people don't realize how much foresight goes into building truly secure software. When I designed Fleet Forward's routing system 3 years ago, I included multiple layers of protection specifically because I was an outside contractor working with a company I didn't completely trust. Every major system component included safeguards against unauthorized access, reverse engineering, and hostile takeover attempts. The most important protection was something I called the Authentication Cascade Protocol. Every 24 hours, the system required secure authentication from my personal devices to confirm authorized operation. Without this daily handshake, the system would gradually restrict access to non-critical functions, eventually locking down completely to prevent theft or sabotage. Back at my apartment, I activated my comprehensive monitoring setup. Multiple screens displaying real-time system status, access logs, and security alerts from Fleet Forward's network. The brute force attacks Derek was attempting were almost comically unsophisticated, like trying to break into Fort Knox with a crowbar. My phone rang constantly throughout the evening. First, Janet. Her voice strained with manufactured concern. Celia, please reconsider what you're doing. This situation doesn't have to escalate into something that hurts everyone involved. Then Marcus, his tone shifting between rage and desperation with each subsequent call. Whatever you think you're accomplishing by being stubborn, you're only making things worse for yourself. We have a business to run here. By 10 o'clock that night, the calls became openly threatening. Celia, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but if our systems aren't fully operational by tomorrow morning, we'll have you arrested for corporate sabotage. I ignored the phone after that, focusing instead on documenting everything for my own legal protection. Screenshots of their unauthorized access attempts, recordings of their threatening voicemails, and detailed logs showing how they were attempting to hack into systems they claimed to own. My best friend Sarah Williams called around 11, her paralegal training immediately apparent in how she approached the situation. Celia, I've been researching similar cases all evening. You're not the first contractor to face intellectual property theft, and there are some interesting precedents that might help. Sarah had worked for a small law firm specializing in employment disputes for 8 years, and her practical understanding of corporate legal tactics proved invaluable. The key thing is documenting everything they do. Companies like Fleet Forward rely on intimidation and time pressure to force settlements, but they're usually operating on much shakier legal ground than they pretend. What did you find about my specific situation? I asked, pulling up my contract on screen while we talked. Your intellectual property clause is rock solid, she replied with obvious satisfaction. I showed it to my boss, and he said it's one of the clearest contractor agreements he's ever seen. The section about security protocols is particularly interesting. You specifically reserved the right to protect your systems against unauthorized access attempts. That detail had seemed like legal boilerplate when my attorney included it 3 years ago, but now it provided crucial protection for what I was planning to do. My contract explicitly stated that my system included security measures designed to prevent theft, and that these measures would activate automatically if unauthorized access was detected. December 21st arrived with more snow and increasingly frantic calls from Fleet Forward. By 8 a.m., their entire dispatch system was displaying warning messages about security protocol violations. Derek's hacking attempts had triggered the first level of my defensive measures, restricting access to non-essential functions and requiring additional authentication for critical operations. Celia, what did you do to our system? Janet's voice cracked with panic when she called just after 9. The dispatchers can't access half the routing functions, and Derek says the security protocols are blocking him out of administrative areas. I didn't do anything, I replied truthfully. Your system detected unauthorized access attempts and activated its built-in security measures. That's exactly what it's designed to do when someone tries to hack into it. This is insane, she said, her professional composure completely gone. You can't just lock us out of our own business operations. It's not your business operations, I corrected. It's my intellectual property licensed for your use under specific contractual terms. When you violated those terms by attempting unauthorized access, the system protected itself automatically. Marcus called 10 minutes later, his voice barely controlled rage. Celia, I don't care what legal games you think you're playing. Our trucks need to roll this morning, and if they don't, you'll be personally liable for every dollar we lose. Marcus, I said calmly, your trucks can roll anytime you want them to. All you need to do is honor our original contract and stop trying to steal my intellectual property. We're not stealing anything, he shouted. We're trying to maintain critical business operations that you're sabotaging out of spite. Then explain why Derek spent all day yesterday trying to crack my administrative passwords. Explain why Janet has been secretly documenting my work for months. Explain why your lawyer tried to intimidate me into surrendering intellectual property rights that were never yours to begin with. The silence on the other end lasted nearly 30 seconds before Marcus hung up. By noon, my monitoring systems showed that Fleet Forward's operations were beginning to experience serious disruptions. Without access to advanced routing algorithms, their dispatchers were reverting to manual methods that couldn't handle the complexity of 700 simultaneous deliveries across 12 states. The most crucial revelation came from my system's financial tracking modules. While reviewing access logs, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. For the past 6 months, Marcus had been using my system's administrative functions to generate false financial reports, hiding unauthorized payments, and creating fictitious consulting contracts that disguised what appeared to be systematic embezzlement. My routing system wasn't just tracking trucks and packages, it was also monitoring operational costs, fuel efficiency, and profitability metrics. Marcus had been manipulating these reports to hide the fact that he was stealing company money using my system's credibility to legitimize fraudulent financial documents. The scope of his theft was staggering. Over 18 months, he had diverted nearly $2 million through fake contracts and inflated operational expenses, betting that the complexity of my system would prevent anyone from discovering his fraud. But the most damning evidence was in his communications logs. My system automatically archived all business communications for regulatory compliance, and those archives contained detailed records of Marcus's negotiations with Fleet Forward's competitors. He hadn't just been planning to steal my system, he had been planning to sell it to the highest bidder, using Fleet Forward's proprietary technology to establish himself as an independent consultant. As December 21st turned into evening, I realized I wasn't just fighting to protect my intellectual property anymore. I was sitting on evidence of federal crimes that could send Marcus to prison for years and potentially save Fleet Forward from complete destruction under his corrupt leadership. The authentication deadline was approaching. In less than 24 hours, my system would require daily verification from my personal devices or begin its complete lockdown sequence. 700 trucks, dozens of employees, and millions of dollars in daily revenue hung in the balance. Marcus and his team still didn't understand what they were really facing. They thought they were dealing with a stubborn contractor who was holding their system hostage out of spite. What they were actually facing was a comprehensive security protocol designed by someone who had anticipated their betrayal and prepared accordingly. My system wasn't just protecting my intellectual property. It was about to expose the criminal conspiracy that had been hiding behind corporate respectability for months. December 22nd dawned with 6 inches of fresh snow and absolute chaos at Fleet Forward Logistics. By 7 a.m., my monitoring systems showed that their routing capabilities had degraded to early 2000s levels, with dispatchers manually plotting routes on printed maps while 700 increasingly frustrated truck drivers called for guidance. The authentication deadline had passed at midnight, triggering the second phase of my security protocols. Critical system functions were now locked behind encrypted barriers that would require my personal intervention to restore. Derek's increasingly desperate hacking attempts only strengthened the system's defensive posture, treating each failed intrusion as confirmation of hostile intent. "Celia, this is a disaster." Janet's voice trembled during her 8 a.m. call. "Half our drivers are sitting in parking lots waiting for route assignments. The other half are driving blind, trying to make deliveries based on yesterday's outdated information. We're going to lose millions of dollars if this continues." "Then stop trying to steal my system," I replied, monitoring their network traffic in real time. "Every hacking attempt Derek makes triggers additional security measures. Your own actions are escalating the lockdown." "Derek isn't hacking anything," she protested. "He's trying to maintain legitimate business operations using systems that should belong to the company." "Janet, I have logs of everything Derek has attempted since yesterday morning. Password dictionary attacks, database intrusion attempts, and systematic efforts to bypass security protocols. In what universe does that constitute legitimate maintenance?" The truth was becoming impossible to deny, but Fleet Forward's leadership had invested too much in their narrative to acknowledge reality. They had convinced themselves that intimidation and legal pressure would force me to surrender, never considering that I might have prepared for exactly this scenario. Marcus's next call came from a different number, his personal cell phone, rather than the office line. "Celia, I'm prepared to discuss a more reasonable settlement. Obviously, there have been some misunderstandings about our respective positions." "What kind of misunderstandings?" I asked, genuinely curious about how he would attempt to spin the situation. "Our legal team may have been overly aggressive in their initial approach. We're willing to acknowledge your intellectual property rights and negotiate a fair licensing expansion that benefits everyone involved." Translation: their lawyers had finally explained that stealing contractor-owned intellectual property was significantly more difficult than Marcus had assumed. But his conciliatory tone came too late and offered too little. "Marcus, you've had 3 years to negotiate fair licensing terms. Instead, you chose to plan a systematic theft campaign, train my replacement in secret, and attempt to intimidate me into surrendering my rights." Why would I trust anything you say now? Because, he said, his voice taking on a harder edge, you're destroying a company that employs 230 people. Whatever grievances you have with management, those employees don't deserve to lose their jobs because of your personal vendetta. The emotional manipulation was sophisticated but predictable. When legal intimidation failed, corporate leaders often resorted to guilt tactics, claiming that protecting your own rights somehow made you responsible for their poor decisions. Marcus, those employees are in danger because you chose to steal intellectual property instead of honoring contracts. You created this crisis with your greed and incompetence. Don't try to blame me for the consequences of your choices. By 10 a.m., Fleet Forward's situation had attracted external attention. Local business reporters began investigating the mysterious technical failure that had crippled one of Dallas's largest logistics companies. Social media posts from frustrated customers started trending with delivery delays affecting everything from medical supplies to Christmas packages. Sarah called with an update from her legal research. Celia, I've been monitoring the business news coverage, and this story is gaining serious traction. 3 different reporters have reached out to employment lawyers asking about intellectual property disputes in the tech industry. Have any of them contacted me directly? I asked. Not yet, but one of them, Rebecca Stone from Dallas Business Weekly, has been investigating Fleet Forward's financial practices for months. She might be interested in a broader story about corporate misconduct. The opportunity was perfect. Instead of waiting for Fleet Forward to control the narrative, I could proactively present my side of the story to a journalist who already understood corporate corruption. Public pressure might accomplish what legal threats couldn't. Meanwhile, Marcus's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. Employee sources, drivers and dispatchers who had my personal contact information from years of collaboration, began calling to report his meltdown in progress. He was screaming at managers, threatening to fire anyone who couldn't solve the crisis, and making wild promises about immediate solutions that everyone knew were impossible. He brought in 3 different software companies this morning. One dispatcher told me confidentially. Told them they had until noon to get our routing system operational again. When they explained they'd need weeks just to understand our data structure, he started yelling about corporate conspiracies and sabotage. The technical reality was stark. No existing software could handle Fleet Forward's specific requirements without months of customization. My system hadn't just automated their operations. It had evolved over 3 years to address thousands of unique challenges that generic logistics software couldn't anticipate. Derek's situation was becoming particularly desperate. According to my system logs, he had moved beyond simple password attacks to attempting database manipulation and code injection techniques that could permanently damage critical components. His amateur hacking attempts were like trying to perform brain surgery with a hammer. Derek called me crying this morning, another employee reported. He's realized he can't crack your system, and Marcus is threatening to fire him if he doesn't restore full operations by end of business today. The kid's in way over his head. By afternoon, Fleet Forward's customer exodus had begun. 3 major contracts, representing nearly 30% of their annual revenue, sent formal notices terminating their agreements due to unacceptable service disruptions. The pharmaceutical company that relied on them for temperature-sensitive medical deliveries couldn't afford the unreliability, and the automotive parts manufacturer needed guaranteed overnight delivery that Fleet Forward could no longer provide. Patricia Montgomery. Fleet Forward's primary investor arrived at headquarters around 3 p.m. Multiple employees reported seeing her black BMW in the executive parking lot, followed by raised voices from the boardroom as she demanded explanations for the company's sudden collapse. Patricia's furious, one manager whispered during a quick call. She's been asking detailed questions about the technical crisis, and Marcus keeps giving her different explanations. First, he said it was a routine software upgrade gone wrong. Then he claimed it was a cyber attack by competitors. Now he's trying to blame everything on a disgruntled contractor. The investigation I had been dreading and anticipating finally came around 4 p.m. FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh called my personal number, her tone professional but clearly serious. Ms. Martinez, we've received a complaint from Fleet Forward Logistics claiming that you've engaged in corporate sabotage and computer crimes. I'd like to schedule a time to discuss the situation and review any evidence you might have regarding these allegations. Agent Walsh. I replied carefully. I'd be happy to cooperate with your investigation. In fact, I have extensive documentation that might interest you regarding intellectual property theft and fraudulent business practices at Fleet Forward. What kind of documentation? Financial records, communication logs, and evidence of systematic embezzlement that's been ongoing for over a year. My routing system automatically archives business communications and tracks operational expenses, and those records show clear patterns of fraud and theft by company management. The silence on the other end lasted nearly 15 seconds. Ms. Martinez, I think we need to have a much longer conversation. Can you come to our offices tomorrow morning? Absolutely. And Agent Walsh, you might want to bring someone from the white-collar crime division. What I've discovered goes far beyond intellectual property disputes. As December 22nd ended with Fleet Forward's operations in complete disarray, I realized the situation had evolved beyond my original goal of protecting my intellectual property. Marcus's attempt to steal my system had inadvertently exposed a criminal conspiracy that threatened the livelihoods of hundreds of employees and the financial security of investors who had trusted him with their money. The authentication timer continued counting down. In less than 24 hours, my system would begin its final lockdown phase, permanently securing all critical components unless I personally intervened to restore access. Marcus still believed he was fighting a contractor dispute. What he was actually facing was a federal investigation that could send him to prison for decades and expose years of criminal behavior that had been hidden behind the success of my stolen innovations. December 23rd arrived crisp and clear, with the previous day's snow creating a deceptively peaceful backdrop for what would become the most decisive day in Fleet Forward's corporate history. I spent the early morning hours preparing comprehensive documentation for my meeting with FBI Special Agent Walsh, organizing 3 years of automatically archived communications, financial records, and system logs that painted a devastating picture of Marcus's criminal enterprise. The evidence was overwhelming in its scope and detail. My routing system had been designed with extensive logging capabilities to help optimize performance and troubleshoot problems. But those same logs had inadvertently captured a comprehensive record of Marcus's embezzlement schemes, fraudulent contracts, and systematic theft of company resources. Agent Walsh met me at the FBI's Dallas field office at 9 a.m., accompanied by Special Agent David Park from the White Collar Crime Division and Assistant U.S. Attorney Lisa Chen. The federal government was clearly taking this situation seriously, which suggested that Marcus's activities were even more extensive than I had realized. Ms. Martinez, Agent Walsh began, as we settled into a sterile conference room. Fleet Forward's management has made some serious allegations about computer crimes and corporate sabotage. Before we discuss those claims, I understand you have information about financial irregularities at the company. I connected my laptop to their presentation system and began walking through the evidence my system had collected. 3 years ago, when I built Fleet Forward's routing system, I included comprehensive financial tracking to help optimize operational costs and identify efficiency improvements. What I discovered by accident was that Marcus Weatherby has been using those same financial modules to hide systematic embezzlement. The first set of documents showed how Marcus had created fictitious consulting contracts with non-existent companies using my system's automated payment processing to authorize transfers to accounts he controlled personally. Over 18 months, he had stolen nearly $2.3 million through these fake contracts. The routing system tracks every operational expense automatically, I explained, highlighting specific transactions on the screen. Fuel costs, maintenance schedules, driver, overtime equipment purchases, everything gets logged and analyzed for efficiency optimization. But Marcus figured out that he could manipulate the reporting functions to hide unauthorized expenses. Agent Park leaned forward with obvious interest. How did he access these financial functions? Wouldn't that require administrative privileges? That's where the intellectual property theft comes in, I replied, pulling up communication logs from the past 6 months. Marcus has been systematically documenting my work and training Derek Thompson to replace me not because they want to improve operations, but because they need to eliminate the only person who understands how the financial tracking really works. The recorded conversations were damning. Marcus explaining to Derek how to access legacy financial modules without triggering audit alerts. Janet discussing how to clean up transaction records before quarterly investor reviews, Bradley Hartwell advising them on legal strategies to claim ownership of my system, specifically to prevent discovery of the embezzlement. This isn't just about stealing my intellectual property, I continued. They need complete control of my system to cover up years of financial crimes. As long as I have access to the audit trails, Marcus can't hide what he's been doing. Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen was taking detailed notes as I walked through the evidence. Ms. Martinez, are you prepared to testify about these findings in federal court? Absolutely, but there's something else you need to know about the current situation at Fleet Forward. I explained how my system's security protocols had triggered in response to Derek's hacking attempts, and how the authentication cascade was designed to prevent exactly the kind of intellectual property theft Marcus was attempting. They're claiming I'm sabotaging their operations, I said, but what's actually happening is that my legally owned system is protecting itself against unauthorized access attempts. Every security measure that's currently active was disclosed in my original contract and designed to prevent theft. Agent Walsh reviewed the contract documents I provided. So Fleet Forward agreed to these security measures when they signed your original consulting agreement. They specifically requested enhanced protection against industrial espionage and competitive intelligence gathering. Marcus was worried about competitors stealing his operational secrets, so he wanted a system that would be impossible to reverse engineer or replicate. The irony was perfect. Marcus had demanded security features to protect against exactly the kind of theft he was now attempting to commit himself. What's the current status of Fleet Forward's operations? Agent Park asked. Complete breakdown, I replied. 700 trucks are essentially operating without centralized coordination. They're losing major contracts, hemorrhaging money, and facing potential bankruptcy within weeks if the situation doesn't improve. And you have the ability to restore normal operations immediately. All I need to do is authenticate my ownership through the security protocols. But doing that would also give me continued access to the financial records that document Marcus's crimes. The federal agents exchanged meaningful looks. Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen spoke carefully. Ms. Martinez, would you be willing to restore Fleet Forward's operational capabilities as part of a federal investigation? Your continued access to those financial records could be crucial for building a comprehensive case against Mr. Weatherby. The opportunity was exactly what I had hoped for, a chance to protect my intellectual property while ensuring that Marcus faced appropriate consequences for his crimes. But before I could answer, Agent Walsh's phone buzzed with an urgent message. "Excuse me," she said, reading the text quickly. "We need to accelerate this timeline. Fleet Forward's board of directors has called an emergency meeting for this afternoon, and our sources suggest they're planning to file criminal charges against you for corporate sabotage." "Based on what evidence?" I asked. "Apparently, Derek Thompson has prepared a technical report claiming that your system's security measures constitute malicious code designed to damage their business operations. They're arguing that you planted a logic bomb, specifically to harm the company if you were ever terminated. The accusation was sophisticated and potentially dangerous. If a prosecutor didn't understand the technical details, Derek's report might make my legitimate security protocols appear to be malicious sabotage." "Agent Walsh," I said, "I can prove that every security measure currently active was explicitly disclosed in my original contract and requested by Fleet Forward's management. But I need to show you something else first." I pulled up the communication archives from the past week, including the recorded conversations from my termination meeting and Marcus's subsequent threatening phone calls. I've been recording everything since they started their theft campaign. Marcus has made explicit threats, admitted to planning intellectual property theft, and even confessed to manipulating financial records to hide his embezzlement. The recording of Marcus's final call was particularly damning. "I don't care what legal games you think you're playing. We'll destroy you in court and take everything you've built just like we should have done from the beginning." Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen smiled grimly. "Mr. Weatherby seems to have a talent for incriminating himself. Ms. Martinez, we're prepared to offer you full immunity in exchange for your cooperation with our investigation. Can you restore Fleet Forward's operations while maintaining access to the financial records we need?" "Yes, but I want something in return beyond immunity." "What do you have in mind?" "I want my intellectual property rights protected permanently. I want a formal acknowledgement that my security protocols were legitimate and lawful, and I want Fleet Forward's current management removed from any position where they can retaliate against employees who cooperate with your investigation." The three federal officials conferred quietly for several minutes before Agent Walsh responded. "We can't make promises about specific outcomes, but we can guarantee that your cooperation will be noted favorably in all legal proceedings, and we'll recommend that the court issue protective orders regarding your intellectual property rights." As we finalized the cooperation agreement, my phone began buzzing with urgent messages from Fleet Forward employees. The emergency board meeting was already underway, and Patricia Montgomery was demanding detailed explanations for the company's financial irregularities that had emerged during the operational crisis. "Marcus is in full panic mode," one manager texted. "He's claiming everything is your fault, but Patricia brought her own accountants, and they're finding discrepancies in financial reports going back 2 years." The investigation was expanding faster than Marcus could control it. What had started as his attempt to steal my intellectual property had inadvertently exposed the criminal conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything he had built through years of systematic fraud. By the time our federal cooperation meeting concluded at noon, Fleet Forward's board of directors had already voted to suspend Marcus pending a comprehensive internal audit. Patricia Montgomery had assumed temporary control of company operations and issued a public statement promising full cooperation with law enforcement investigations. The authentication deadline was less than 12 hours away. Soon I would restore my system's full functionality and watch as 3 years of hidden crimes were finally exposed to the light. Marcus's attempt to steal my life's work was about to cost him his freedom, his reputation, and everything he had stolen from the company and employees who had trusted him. December 24th began before dawn with the sound of federal agents executing search warrants at Fleet Forward headquarters and Marcus Weatherby's luxury home in Highland Park. I watched the news coverage from my apartment while preparing to restore my system's full operational capabilities as part of my cooperation agreement with the FBI. Agent Walsh called at 6 a.m. with an update that exceeded even my expectations for justice. "Ms. Martinez, we arrested Marcus an hour ago on charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, computer fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence you provided gave us everything we needed for immediate indictments." The scope of Marcus's criminal enterprise had expanded significantly overnight as federal accountants analyzed the financial records my system had preserved. Beyond the $2.3 million I had initially discovered, they found evidence of additional fraud schemes involving fake vendor contracts, inflated operational expenses, and systematic theft from employee benefit funds. "What about Derek and Janet?" I asked. "Derek is cooperating fully and will likely face minimal charges in exchange for his testimony. Janet's situation is more complicated. She was clearly involved in the intellectual property theft conspiracy, but her level of knowledge about the financial crimes is still under investigation." At 8 a.m., Patricia Montgomery called me personally for the first time since the crisis began. Her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent days discovering that everything she thought she knew about her investment was built on criminal fraud. "Celia," she said, "I owe you an enormous apology. I've spent the past 72 hours learning the truth about what Marcus was doing to this company and to you personally. The board has voted unanimously to offer you the position of Chief Technology Officer with full equity participation and complete intellectual property protections. The offer was comprehensive and generous: a permanent leadership position, significant ownership stake in the company, and ironclad legal protections for my innovations. But more importantly, it represented acknowledgement that my contributions had been systematically undervalued and exploited by Marcus's regime. "Patricia," I replied, "I'm interested in discussing the position, but I have some conditions that need to be met first." "Name them." "Complete operational independence for my technology division authority to implement ethical guidelines for all technical staff and formal protections for employees who report misconduct or corruption." "Done. Celia, this company wouldn't exist without your innovations. Marcus nearly destroyed everything you built, and we're committed to making sure nothing like this ever happens again." At 10 a.m., I arrived at Fleet Forward headquarters for the first time as an employee rather than a contractor. The building buzzed with nervous energy as word spread about Marcus's arrest and the federal investigation's scope. Employees who had spent years under his increasingly paranoid leadership seemed almost giddy with relief that his reign of intimidation had finally ended. Derek approached me in the lobby, his face flushed with embarrassment and genuine remorse. "Ms. Martinez, I need to apologize for everything I did over the past few weeks. Marcus convinced me that you were trying to sabotage the company, and I believed him because I wanted the job he was offering." "Derek," I said, "you were manipulated by someone with years of experience at corporate deception. The important thing is that you chose to tell the truth when it mattered." The system restoration process took less than 30 minutes. With my personal authentication restored, the routing algorithms immediately resumed full operation, and 700 trucks across 12 states began receiving optimized route assignments for the first time in 3 days. The employee celebration was immediate and genuine. Dispatchers cheered as their screens filled with comprehensive routing data. Drivers called in expressing relief that they could finally provide customers with accurate delivery estimates. Operations managers who had spent days manually coordinating logistics with spreadsheets and phone calls watched in amazement as the AI took over their most complex challenges. Janet's situation proved more nuanced than I had expected. She approached me in the late morning, her professional composure completely stripped away, to reveal someone who genuinely understood the magnitude of her mistakes. "Celia, I can't excuse what I did," she said, tears visible in her eyes. "I let my ambition blind me to what was really happening. I thought Marcus was just being aggressive about business optimization, and I convinced myself that helping him was advancing my career. Janet, what you did was collaborate in systematic theft of my intellectual property while pretending to be my friend and colleague. The personal betrayal hurts more than the professional damage." "I know. I've asked Patricia to demote me to an entry-level position where I can't hurt anyone else while I figure out how to rebuild some kind of integrity." The gesture was meaningful, though it couldn't undo years of calculated deception. Janet's willingness to accept consequences and genuinely change her behavior would determine whether any kind of professional relationship might be possible in the future. By afternoon, the transformation at Fleet Forward was remarkable. With Marcus's paranoid leadership style eliminated, employees began collaborating openly, sharing ideas that had been suppressed under his regime of fear and retaliation. The company's customer service scores improved dramatically as reliable delivery schedules resumed, and several clients who had terminated their contracts expressed willingness to reconsider their decisions. The federal investigation continued to expand throughout the day. Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen called with updates about additional charges being filed against Marcus, as forensic accountants uncovered the full scope of his financial crimes. The total theft exceeded $4 million, involving complex schemes that had been operating for nearly 4 years. "He's going to plead guilty to avoid trial," she informed me. "The evidence is overwhelming, and his defense attorneys are already negotiating sentencing terms. He'll likely serve 8 to 12 years in federal prison." Bradley Hartwell's law firm issued a public statement distancing themselves from Marcus's activities and announcing their withdrawal from all Fleet Forward-related matters. The firm faced potential disbarment proceedings for their role in the intellectual property theft conspiracy, and several clients had already terminated their relationships rather than risk association with the scandal. Christmas Eve dinner became an impromptu celebration with Sarah and several Fleet Forward employees who had become genuine friends during the crisis. We gathered at my apartment, sharing stories about the week's dramatic events and reflecting on how quickly corporate corruption could be exposed when the right evidence emerged. "You know what I find most satisfying," Sarah said, as we sat around my kitchen table. "Marcus spent years thinking he was smarter than everyone else, manipulating systems and people to enrich himself. But ultimately his own greed destroyed him. The system he tried to steal was the same system that documented all his crimes. The poetic justice was undeniable. Marcus's attempt to claim ownership of my innovations had inadvertently preserved the evidence needed to convict him of federal crimes. His paranoia about external threats had blinded him to the reality that his greatest enemy was his own criminal behavior." On Christmas morning, I received a call from Rebecca Stone, the investigative journalist who had been following the Fleet Forward story. "Celia, I wanted to thank you for your courage in exposing this situation. Your story has already inspired 3 other contractors to come forward with evidence of intellectual property theft at their companies." The broader impact was something I hadn't anticipated. By fighting to protect my own rights, I had inadvertently created a precedent that might help other independent contractors and consultants who faced similar exploitation by unscrupulous corporate management. New Year's Day marked my official start as Fleet Forward's Chief Technology Officer. The company had stabilized financially with customer confidence restored and federal investigators completing their evidence collection. My equity stake made me one of the company's largest individual shareholders, transforming me from an exploited contractor into a genuine partner in the business I had helped create. The routing system continued to evolve under my leadership, incorporating new optimization algorithms and predictive analytics that pushed efficiency improvements beyond what Marcus had ever achieved through his criminal schemes. Employee satisfaction scores reached record highs as the culture of fear and retaliation was replaced by collaborative innovation and ethical business practices. 6 months later, Marcus Weatherby was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and ordered to pay complete restitution for his theft. Janet had earned a promotion back to mid-level management through genuine effort to rebuild her integrity and contribute positively to the company's ethical transformation. Derek became one of my most reliable technical staff members, his experience with Marcus's manipulation making him particularly effective at identifying and preventing potential security threats. The most profound satisfaction came from knowing that my decision to fight for my rights had protected not just my own interests, but the livelihoods of hundreds of employees who depended on Fleet Forward for their economic security. Marcus's criminal enterprise would have eventually destroyed the company entirely, leaving families without income and customers without essential services. Standing in my office on the anniversary of my termination, watching my routing system coordinate seamless deliveries across the country, I reflected on the life lesson that had emerged from those dark December days. Individual courage to confront injustice creates ripple effects that protect entire communities of people who might otherwise suffer in silence. The technology I had built to optimize logistics had ultimately optimized something more important: the alignment between corporate success and ethical behavior. Companies that respect intellectual property rights, treat contractors fairly, and operate with transparency don't just avoid criminal liability. They create environments where innovation thrives and everyone benefits from shared success. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't just protecting what belongs to you, but ensuring that your fight creates a safer, more just environment for everyone who faces similar challenges in the future. Have you ever had to stand up for your rights in a professional situation where powerful people were trying to take advantage of you? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone else who's facing a similar challenge. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to help others find it. Subscribe for more real-life stories about justice and resilience, and share this with anyone who might need encouragement to fight for what's rightfully theirs. Thank you for listening, and remember, your integrity and determination are more powerful than any corporate intimidation tactic. Stay strong, and I'll see you in the next story.